Hello, everyone. My name is Darren Davidson. I'm moderating this morning. I'm a member of the board and the operating committee of CoNPS. I am honored to call Dr. Jennifer Bousselot a friend and colleague. She has played an instrumental role in the Colorado Native Plant Society, and she is an ambassador and advocate for Colorado native plants in general. She completed her doctorate research studying green roof species selection, including Colorado native plants, and she's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture at Colorado State University. She's become a highly sought-after speaker, and we are lucky to have her here today. Everyone, please welcome Jen.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Darren. That is that was not the bio I gave you. But thank you. You included it in there, but wow, it sounds so much more impressive when you introduced me. Thank you, Darren. It is such a pleasure to be here. As many of you know, I was the previous marketing and events coordinator for the Colorado Native Plant Society. And so I used to help run these from 2015 to 2018. I was sort of the ghost behind the curtain running a lot of it. So it's a real delight to be back. I was actually able to go to the 2019 one as well and present an award. So I'm really delighted to come present on a topic here in 2020. Well, I'm really delighted to talk about Colorado native plant availability in the green industry. That is one of my greatest passions in the native plant world, mostly because I really find it important to make the connection between what we enjoy in nature and what we enjoy in our own landscapes. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, give you a couple of lists, and I'm going to have those lists available. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about a research project I've done in my research role at Colorado State University. So really, it's a combination of professional and personal experience that drew me to native plants. As Darren mentioned, my green roof research is where I really embraced native plants. That was about 12, 13 years ago. We really started looking closely at Colorado native plants because they're so ideally suited to the tough growing conditions on top of buildings. And so that was my entree into native plants. So I've been a strong advocate for native plants ever since then. I'm also an avid hiker and gardener. Earlier this year, I was honored to give a talk to the Colorado Native Plant Society group that signed up for the garden tours. And here's the title of my talk, Suburban Front Yard Redesign. So this spring, during our stay-at-home order, this is what we did. We had a landscape architect friend of ours redesign our front yard, and we redid it. So in that journey, I discovered exactly what species are available or not available in the green industry. So that's sort of, the personal side for me, but I've also worked in extension at the county level in Colorado early in my career, and at the state level later on in my career in Iowa. And in that role of being a horticulturalist in extension, I, came across availability of native plants quite often. And so that really gave me broad perspective. Of course, again, my green roof research, also my work at the Colorado Native Plant Society. When I was early on back at CSU teaching in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, I only taught a couple classes a year. So when I saw the job for marketing and CoNPS, I was like, that's perfect. I was so delighted to run it. But now, of course, I'm full-time at CSU, so I had to gradually give up. Although I am actually very, very part-time doing book sales, since a book I'll mention in the next slide was published by the Colorado Native Plant Society. And so I help manage the book sales, and I just got another order yesterday, since all the national and state parks are opening again in the Southwest. I also do work on native plants at Colorado State University. So I'm going to tell you about a USDA grant that I got. That'll be sort of the last half-ish of my talk. And I'm going to go through sort of the need that's there. Here's my experiment over the summer, and my undergraduate student who helped me with that project, smiling in the back, Caitlin, was a trooper on this. And so we were evaluating native plants to make sure they're more available in the green industry, because there's a bottleneck there that I'll describe, and I'll tell you about how we're just beginning to scratch the surface of the mysteries on why. But first, I have to mention somebody who has been very important in my life, my mentor, Jack Carter. As many of you know, he passed away, unfortunately, this spring after a fall. And he is an incredible person to emulate. So he's a native plant advocate. He's a botanist first, but has really kind of turned into a gardener and connoisseur of all things native plants. So he was a botany professor, mostly at Colorado College, but he was also at CU and Emporia State and Simpson College in Iowa. And we have a lot of experience back in Iowa that we sort of crossed paths, just 50 years apart. But he's the author of 3 major titles. You might be familiar with some of them: Trees and Shrubs of Colorado, Trees and Shrubs of New Mexico, and Common Southwestern Native Plants. And so he has 7 editions of those 3 titles. We have the 8th one coming out posthumously very soon, and it's the Trees and Shrubs of New Mexico 3rd edition. I am literally putting on the very final touches of changes to nomenclature in that book right now. I just wrote the preface yesterday, in fact. So thankfully, we're going to continue his legacy. And as I mentioned, in later life, he really became a gardener, and he's such a systems thinker. He really discovered, well, lots of people have noticed this, but he really noticed how if people valued native plants on hikes, they probably wanted to value them at home. And so he had helped when he and his dear wife Martha lived in New Mexico for 24 years. They helped put a plant sale together through the Native Plant Society of New Mexico, their Gila chapter. And we actually did about the same thing up here in Colorado as well, except we put it all in line while I was the coordinator. So he's really a field botanist at heart. And I'm a horticulturalist, so we actually had a little bit of a rivalry on our different areas of interest, which I found rather hysterical. It kind of got both of us very excited, but I needed to honor him because he has directed my journey related to native plants so tremendously. So here's a couple of pictures related to him. The one where he's standing up is in the Jack L. Carter Herbarium, named after him at Colorado College, just about 2 years ago. And then him sitting down, the 7 titles or the 7 editions of his 3 titles. He's holding a stack. That was a monumental moment. We were getting ready for his 90th birthday party. And it was so delightful to be able to have him, place his life's work in his lap like that. So that was incredible. And here you see at the top the cover of our book. In fact, Emily Clapper mentioned Felucia paradoxa was her favorite native plant. That's a close one for me too. Some days I say it's that one because it changes daily. And that's on the bookshelf at the CSU bookstore next to Jennifer Ackerfield's Flora. And down below Jennifer Ackerfield's is Denise Culver's Field Guide to Wetland Plants. So it's pretty phenomenal the amount of contributions he's had and how his impact has just been woven throughout the last 5 decades of Colorado native plant history. So with Jack's influence, but really with, a lot of my sort of collection of experiences, I am eager to also be bringing nature home. So of course, that's the title of a book by Doug Tallamy, but I really feel like I need to live that. That's an important part for me, to be a Colorado resident and bring those Colorado native plants to my house. So that's part of why my personal side, we really want to focus on that for this talk. All right. So one of the first questions I get when I start talking about Colorado native plants and where they're available is, where do I buy native plants? And just to give you all a heads up, I'm going to ask you after a bit, not yet, to contribute to this conversation. So I just want to make sure, ooh, good question, Joyce. I'm not sure when that next book is coming out from Doug Tallamy. So I want to make sure you've got a heads up on this. I also want to give you a resource. So if you're sitting at your computer, you can go and do this right now. So at CoNPS.org, so the CoNPS website, if you search in the search criteria, which is at the lower right-hand side of the website, and you type in native plant vendor list, you'll see a list circa January 2019 of vendors that sell Colorado native plants. This was, I updated that from some work that had been previously done on it, and we uploaded it about a year and a half ago. And it's a constantly evolving list. Unfortunately, a number of our retail stores have closed, unfortunately. So we're going to probably have to modify that list. And I added a few more, actually. So I actually separated this into a couple of categories. So I'm going to start first with the retail native plant vendors. So on the list, almost all of these are listed on the January 2019 edition of the native plant vendor list, but I've added a few actually to this. So there's the Colorado State Forest Service that predominantly works on trees and shrubs. Chelsea Nursery, they're a Western Slope nursery. They do both wholesale and retail. Predominantly woodies, but they do some perennials as well. Creekside Tree Nursery, also woodies. The Flower Bin, they do pretty much everything. Fort Collins Nursery, so that's the retail. Harlequin's Gardens, they're in Boulder, and they have been a big supporter of the Colorado Native Plant Study for a long time. And they are also ones that help supply us with our previous sales we did in online for the Colorado Native Plant Society plant sale. Also, High Plains Environmental Center, I had to give them a shout out. I'm on their board of directors. It's in Loveland, Colorado, and they are sort of a hybrid of an open space and botanical garden together. They call themselves a living laboratory, but they have a fairly large native plant nursery. They're usually only open for retail sales a few times a year, but they've been doing an online plant sale this year. So, and they have some of the hardest to get native plants available. And then a number of nurseries that are literally open to the public all the time. So Highlands Garden Center, Nick's Garden Center, Tagawa Garden Center, and Wilmore Nursery. I skipped Perennial Favorites because I'm not so sure they're still open. I tried to look yesterday and I couldn't tell. They're in Rye, Colorado. So that's your retail list. Start thinking about some other retailers that we can add to this list. I kind of want to crowdsource here to find out where some of the other ones are located. There's also those vendors that specialize in seed. Now, this is a mix of companies that are wholesale and retail combined. But if your project or your needs are coming up with the requirements for seed, here's a large number of them. So Applewood Seed Company, Arkansas Valley Seed Company, Beauty Beyond Belief Seed, Dean Swift Seed, Pawnee Butte Seed, Sharp Brothers Seed, Southwest Seed, and Western Native Seed. I found Western Native Seed especially has some very hard to get species. He does, I believe, all wild collecting with permits. And so he has an interesting list of species that you can't get everywhere. So, oh, fantastic. I'm seeing some suggestions already popping in here. So We've got high country gardens. Yes, you know what? That's true. I always think of them as a southwest. So, but yes, they do have a whole bunch of specific to Colorado native plants. We need to add that to the list. Ooh, I don't know Camelot Gardens in Montrose. That is fantastic. Alpengardner in Crested Butte. Oh, Crested Butte, South End in Gunnison. Yes, I've heard of Alpengardner. Wendy, we tried to get a tour there, actually, believe it or not, when we held our Western Slope conference there a couple of years ago. Creekside, yep, the Creekside Tree Nursery. I should mention it's that's actually the same. There's two, I believe, locations for that. Granite Seed, never heard of them. Fantastic in Denver. Oh, Ectors. We needed to include Ectors. You're right, Ginger. Alplains Seed out of Kiowa. Oh, I had no idea. That is fantastic. Thank you, Darren, for capturing this. And yes, Raman, we have Pawnee Buttes on the seed side of the list. So you might have been typing that before I popped that up. And then there's actually a whole bunch of wholesalers as well. So depending on your project, or if you are a business, you might be able to do wholesale. Sometimes some of these wholesalers, if they know you, they'll also sell plants to you. So a couple of them on our list, the CoNPS.org vendor list: Aquatic and Wetland Nursery from out northeast, Arbor Valley at Franktown. In fact, they've helped me many times when I was the horticulture agent in Douglas County for CSU Extension. Arbor Valley, it was actually Country Lane then, used to supply us with all of our plant needs. They're fantastic, but they have a heart for natives. Desert Canyon Farm, which I had not heard of or interacted with prior to the list. Two more wholesalers: Fort Collins Wholesale Nursery and Little Valley Wholesale. They have been tremendous and really helped us out on the CoNPS plant sale over the years. In fact, usually they swoop in sort of at the last minute and help us with things we can't source otherwise or have been sold out. And then two further south, I believe both in Pueblo, but one of them might be in Colorado Springs, is Sunscapes Nursery and Wild Things Nursery. So I didn't add on here one that you might all be wondering about, LaPorte Avenue Nursery, because I'm not sure if they still specialize in and sell a lot of our especially alpine species. So I did not include them on here, but it's definitely worth mentioning that they are a potential possibility in wholesale as well. And Darren thinks they're closed. I think so too. So Robert had a question. I'm sorry, I haven't checked on this very much, but since I'm at sort of a breaking point, ooh, thanks, Peg. Brady's in Canyon City. I had no idea. Never heard of it. That's fantastic. But Robert said, being from the Midwest, I'm used to buying seed. Oh, for replanting prairies. Is there a good seed supplier with seeds appropriate to Durango? Good question. You know, there used to be. But Southwest Seed is probably the one that's the closest to you. Oh, good. So Kirk at LaPorte is still doing conifers. I thought so. And a few alpines. So good to know. But yeah, I think your best bet, Robert, would be either Southwest Seed or Western Native Seed as a company. Oh, and Resource Central. Yes, Resource Central does do, they do like garden in a box. So that's another option, although they did not want to play well with us in previous years. They did not want CoNPS to have their plant distribution at the same place because they thought it was a competition. So great. I'm glad, Susan, that you found the slides with the list of vendors and the list of plants. I'm going to get to the plants next, and we're going to do something similar.
Hey, Jen.
Yes.
There were a few questions early on that I thought I would just read to you quickly.
Awesome.
And maybe you're going to cover this, but how do we encourage neighbors to plant native?
Oh, good luck. So that's a great one. one of the things we did, we have a turf heavy neighborhood. It was established in the 70s and 80s when turf was like the sign of you've prospered. And so really we've had to demonstrate, unfortunately. That's the tough thing in our society, is trying to get your neighbor to have the same values as you. So I'm not sure, good luck. However, homeowners associations, there are some ways to influence them, which can have a bit of a trickle over effect. Go to Front Range Wild Ones. You can search them online. And their parent organization, Wild Ones, actually has a series of resources for encouraging your HOA to use more native plants in their areas. So to me, I think that would be a great place to start.
Excellent. And then one other one that was early on, are big box and grocery stores still selling plants with neonics, or have they stopped using them?
Great question. I am not sure about the neonics, honestly. I'm afraid I don't know if they have. You'd probably have to contact them independently.
Okay, and then there are some other ones coming in. Do you want to keep going with your presentation or take a few more questions?
Let's take a few more questions.
Okay, so do you see the one that says, what do you think about color morphs of Achillea and other modified natives? Do they count as natives?
Great question, Wendy. Yes, I do see that one. So I created in the slightly longer way to answer this. I created this little continuum of native to invasive, and there's quite the number of shades of gray between ecotypic native and 100% invasive. And personally, but this can, this really depends on your perspective in the plant world. But personally, I try to tend as close to the ecotypic native, so the native to that place, as I can. But the further down the line, closest to true native, I prefer, because there's some research out of Vermont so far, but I hear there's some other projects going on. The closest to full-blooded native. Sorry, I'm sort of mixing some metaphors here, but the more useful for the largest quantity of pollinators as possible. Plus, there's more genetic diversity. So I'm not saying no, don't buy those. But if you can select things, for your purposes that are as close to truly native to that spot, I believe that's an important thing.
Great. Okay. We have a comment about turf grows Japanese beetles. Removing some reduces the beetles.
Yes.
Fair point. And then Joyce says, explain the relationship among birds, native insects, and native plants. Check out Rocky Mountain Audubon. They have lots of information.
They do. And yes, that's essentially, you're referring to wildscaping, and I've given lots of talks on that as well. And that's not as germane as finding the native plants. But I get what you're saying, Joyce. I think you're right. It's important to say there's a strong connection between native plants, native pollinators, and native birds, all being necessary to have a healthy ecosystem. That's correct.
Okay, and then maybe last one for now. Is there a place to buy native grass sod or plants, since I have not been successful with grass seed?
Ooh, great, Karen. I know that Aquatic and Wetland Nursery does sell some sods, but they might be high water sod. I do know that there is a few companies that will sell buffalo grass. I just don't know who is doing it right now as sod, and potentially even blue grama as sod. So great question. I'm afraid I don't know for sure who that would be. It wouldn't be any of these companies. It would be a sod company. So I would start calling around to sod companies. So I wanted to start a list, and thankfully my dear friend Lisa Olson, who I see is on is one of the participants today, helped me start this list. In fact, the majority come from her list. I just added a few more to her list. And after this slide and the next slide, we're going to talk about some other Colorado native plants that are commonly available in the industry. So the struggle is usually you gotta have to search everywhere to find those hard to find woody plants and grasses and perennials. You have to kind of call around to a whole bunch of companies. I did that this spring as I was trying to redo my front yard. So I know that sort of pain, but Lisa started drafting this list and she did a great job of those that are easier to find or more abundant. Essentially, there's a large number of conifers. So there's the higher water use ones, relatively higher water use, like white fir, Abies concolor, Colorado spruce, even limber pine or ponderosa pine will do well if there's irrigation nearby. If you really need a conifer for dry, Rocky Mountain juniper, Juniper scopulorum, and pinyon, Pinus edulis are good choices. And the majority of all of these are available not abundantly everywhere, but usually you can call around to nurseries to be able to find some. Just depends on what size, what time of year, those kinds of things on their availability. So a couple of the trees, we have a few large trees that you can use in my tree section. So big tooth maple, Acer granditatum, sensational tree, kind of hard to find. Box elder and aspen are the majority of the larger trees. We also have small trees, large shrubs or small trees. A lot of these can be pruned up to become small trees, and these are ideal. So it's chokecherry, Prunus virginiana, common hop tree, Tilia trifoliata, gamble oak, Quercus gambellii, smooth sumac, Rus glabra, and silver buffalo berry, Shepherdea argentea. In fact, a dear friend of mine called me one day, Connie Holstinger, and she goes, Jen, what am I going to do about this silver buffalo berry? It's just taking over its spot. So I said, hey, I've seen those look really nice, pruned up, to look a little bit more like the shape of a service berry. So you prune up the lower branches and it can kind of look like a small tree. So I think, these last several on the tree section could be ideal for use as small trees in urban landscapes. And then, of course, there's the shrubs, and this really just scratches the surface of shrubs that are available. But along, Colorado has an abundance of shrubs and the smaller perennials and grasses. Not as many conifers and trees available on their list, of course. So a couple of good ones are manzanita or kinnikinnick, the Arctostaphylos. I'll talk about a couple of those. Sagebrush, serviceberry, lead plants, all the amorphous, since they're in the legume family, Fabaceae, they are terrific at fixing nitrogen. Red oyster dogwood for a little bit more moist areas, mountain mahogany, rabbit brush, Apache plume, New Mexico privet, which can actually also be a small tree, creeping grape holly, and western sandterry. Oh, and I almost forgot boulder raspberry on this list, Rubus deliciosus. I keep hearing that people are not able to find this plant, but I actually found one at Wilmore Nursery just a couple miles from my house in Littleton they're near Broadway and County Line Road. All right, so next on to the grasses and perennials. So these are the ones that are a little bit more common, and I wish I could give you lists from each of those vendors that I mentioned, the wholesale, retail, and seed companies. But unfortunately, I didn't have time, and their inventories change so often to be able to sort of line up that matrix. But at least the majority of these are available from those organizations as a whole. So some grasses, big blue stem, Andropogon gerardii, side oats grama, blue grama are state grass, buffalo grass, Bucloidactyloides, Indian rice grass, little blue stem, Schizachrium, Scoparium, switchgrass, and pre-dropseeds, Bravolis heterolepsis are all fairly commonly available, some more than others. I know the Indian rice grass and the prairie drop seed I have had to get through High Plains Environmental Center because I couldn't find them anywhere else. Most of the rest are available elsewhere. So most of those seed companies you saw have them available as seed. And then increasingly, a lot of our native grasses are becoming available as in containers too, which is really nice because they look so amazing in different seasons. For example, little blue stem, Schizachyrium scoparium, starting to give some of its russet red foliage already now. So it's pretty phenomenal in a container. Some perennials, and really this is a small list. It's the next two columns. It's a small list, but it at least gives you the ones that are the most readily available. So milkweeds, several of the Asclepias. There's really three you can find: Asclepias incarnata, the swamper rose milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa, the butterfly milkweed, or speciosa, the showy milkweed. Chocolate flower, several cacti. Probably the three most common, as Lisa pointed out in the list she shared with me, are those in these three genera: Toya, Echinocereus, and Opuntia. There's also purple prairie clover, Engelmann's daisy, Engelmannia persistenia, which is even better, in my opinion, than Berlandaria lyrata, the chocolate flower. And very similar in its bloom time. It just doesn't stop blooming, actually, all summer long. Sulfur flower buckwheat and prairie smoke. I may actually talk about a couple of those in my research. Some others are golden aster, Heterotheca filosa, spotted blazing star, wild blue flax. My favorite currently, Colorado fourclack, because they just look amazing right now. Bee balm, a couple of the Enotheras, including the tufted evening primrose, many beard tongues. Penstemons, you could have an entire talk on penstemons. I think we have actually in our CoNPS annual conference. So an incredible number of species that are available. I'm seeing a lot of chat, which is absolutely fantastic. Oops, did I mess up I did. I put Sargassum nutans after switchgrass and pedicum. I'm sorry. Oops, that was me moving through a little too quickly. Forgive me. So as I see you're all chatting, that was the next thing I wanted to put in there is what other plants. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a grant, and it's called Colorado Native Plant Finishing Protocols for the Horticulture Industry. So what it was a collaboration with Plant Select on evaluating 13 native plants that are in their program. So we actually surveyed the growers nationwide in the Plant Select organization on these plants, plus about another 20 others, on their tips and tricks for getting plants to look good in containers. We found out there was a bottleneck. Usually a lot of our native plants are easy to propagate, and then if they look good, they're easy to sell. But the trouble is, in between there, at the point where they're sizing up into containers and then selling them, they have a tendency to not look good. And so we wanted to investigate that. So we did a 12-week finishing protocol. We were really evaluating substrates because our survey for all those growers pointed out that it really has to do with the different substrates. So the material that these plants are sized up in their containers. So we're going to repeat it next year. And actually, we're going to include a watering frequency aspect as a factor because we found out partway through the summer, we let the plants sort of tell us when they needed water. And so we watered, it was every 2 days, except at first. And then at the last 2 weeks, we actually watered every day because it was so hot. But we did every other day. But most garden centers water every single day, no matter if the plant needs it or not. So that's why we're going to include watering frequency as a factor next year. So there's my student again, starting to harvest our plants. So we had a specialty crop block grant through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and that's a USDA funding source. All right, so here's our substrate treatments. We used LC1. That was our sort of typical substrate for use in containers. It's predominantly peat, but also has perlite and vermiculite in there. It's a sterile growing mix, very common in the industry. Then we took that LC1 as our base and we mixed in by volume various other materials, sand, to see if we simply needed to increase the drainage, so about 30% by volume, and it was mason sand. You can see a picture of it there. Another product called Command with just one M, which I don't really get, but we included it by 15% by volume, and it is a proprietary blend of enzyme producing microbes. So I wasn't quite sure. It's basically a compost, as you can see by the image. It's basically a compost that has a blend of enzyme producing microbes. And then we used EcoGrow, which is just a specific type of compost. So I'll use that interchangeably with compost. As we found a lot in the literature, as well as the survey of growers, that compost included in the peat moss blend was something that was used often to create successful growth of native plants in general. And then we did a treatment with native soil. So because of its weight, we did a 10% by volume to see if there were some there were things about the soil, say if it was the microorganisms in it, soil structure, texture, things like that would influence plants. So what we found, don't get overwhelmed by this, we're going to break it down very quickly by species, but what we found was quite a variable response. And first thing I want you to note, this is just 1 year of data, so I don't have significant differences yet. Let me explain what my values are. So these values here are what we call a plant growth index. So they're taking width 1 and then the measurement of width 2, which is at the opposite angle to that. So it's essentially an X, the opposite width, and then the height. And then we add those together and divide it by 3 to give a growth index. And that growth index tells us the relative success of the plants themselves. So how large they are, how much space they take up. So I'll just jump through real quickly. We did the Windwalker Big Blue Stem, and we found different values. Some of the best responses were in sands, that good drainage, and Command. So we had the largest plants in that 3D plant size in those treatments. Not a significant amount of difference in the mock bearberry, the Arctostophilus colorensis. We did see Command had a little bit of a response. For the chieftain on that same hybrid, we saw the control. So having just straight the LC1, the peat, was actually resulted in the largest plants. The Canna Creek sulfur buckwheat, that one showed us, and we'll see if it trends the same next year, that having good drainage or sand really resulted in much larger plants. GM triflorum, one of the interesting things to note here is you see there's a negative value in the native column. Essentially, those plants lost growth from planting to, because what I did was I took the difference between their size at planting on those 3 measurements and their size at harvest 12 weeks later. And it actually lost growth on native soils, which was not great, I didn't think, but Command ended up with large. A little bit harder to get because it's so hard to size up, not hard to germinate, but hard to size up. Liatris ligula stylus. We saw actually the control with the native, not far behind, was ideal, but sand was not preferred. Mirabilis multiflora, pretty even keel across the board. It pretty much responded to everything, with sand being the least. Penstemon rastiflorus, it actually had the best in the control, so it must be ideal in containers, and probably part of why it's a plant select plant. A selection of Penstemon pinifolius, sunset glow, the orangey one. You see actually pretty good results in the native and the Command categories. Penstemon pseudospectabilis, pretty similar across the board, but with the native, there must be something about native soils that it really needs. Rhamnus smithi, which is a lovely shrub, but notoriously challenging to size up. We saw quite the response in that command treatment, although the numbers on this were super low. Instead of 5 plants per treatment, we started with 3 plants per treatment just because we couldn't get a hold of this in very large numbers. And verbena, or glandularia, our lavender, valley lavender plains verbena, it did pretty well across the board, with actually the lowest results in the native category, which surprised me a little bit. So there I am with questions, and I've been seeing the questions pop up. So Darren, if you can help me sort out
Yes.
The most popular themes, that'd be great.
I will. I've been pulling them off
Thanks.
to keep up. So one question was, are there any landscape designers who are experts in designing gardens using natives? And with that, I'll do a quick plug that if you visit the silent auction, there is an option for a design done using native plants. But Jen, if you have any input on that.
I do. So I have several. Ann Clark in Northern Colorado, Allison Peck at Matrix Gardens in Boulder, and my friend Carla Dakin, who did my landscape in Louisville, are 3 that I can think of off the top of my head. But my friend Lisa Olson is also trying to get that collection, so she might have that list available. I believe she's giving a talk on a similar topic at our Landscaping with Native Plants conference coming up in February.
Great, thank you. Somebody asked about native seed swaps, and someone else answered Wild Ones is having a native seed swap on October 4th. Next question, have you ever seen Juniperus communis for sale?
Yes, I have it in my yard. So I found it at Wilmore, I believe. So yes, it was a cultivar, which I'm not thrilled about, but I really wanted that look in my front yard. So I definitely have found that places.
Okay, and can you rename the nursery where you found the Boulder raspberry?
Yes, that's also Wilmore. They have quite the native plants selection. They did at least this spring, and it's its own section away from the rest, so they actually irrigate it less, which is wonderful.
Okay, and someone else in the chat just said that you can get that at Harlequin's in Boulder too.
They were out when I asked this spring.
Oh, okay. I love the Ceanothus velutinus. Any sources there?
Yikes. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
In the past, Critision jubatum, don't know if I'm saying that correctly, was not available because ranchers hated it. And then somebody says that it's a great one on reservoir margins that fluctuate a lot. And is it out there and available now?
You know, I don't know for sure. I would check with the aquatic and wetland plants first, and go from there. I have not seen it anywhere.
Okay. Somebody commented on shrubs. Why isn't Arctostaphylos uva ursi available? I only find the Arcto X variety.
Coloranthus,
And also, why are only the Asiatic ephedras available and not the ones native to North America?
I've also wondered the same, and I wonder if that's a bit of a, rancher's prejudice there again, because they're always trying to get rid of it, like Mormon tea, right? I'm not totally sure why. I think if you're on the western slope, you might find it more. I believe I saw it on the list through Chelsea Gardens, but that was probably long ago. What was the first part of the question again, Darren?
Only being able to find Arctostaphylos X variety.
Yeah, so you can actually still find Kinnikinnick some places because uva ursi is around, but you're gonna have to call around. I bought it when I lived in like 20 years ago in Highlands Ranch. I would buy it at Tagawa. So you might have to call around. You can still find uva ursi. It's just not as common because the other manzanitas have sort of taken up its spot.
Okay, thank you. Um, which kinds of the many, which of the many, many kinds of native soil did you use in your experiment?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So, Ross Shregley had a spot that he dug up some native soil that had just been deposited from a recent scrape um, by, oh, it was by, what's the reservoir? Horsetooth Reservoir. And so we haven't run its analysis yet, but we're going to run that after the winter as we're planting our next round in the spring. So we don't have like a soil texture analysis on it yet, but it was a clayey, it was a high pH clayey soil.
Okay. Um, questions are still coming in, but we're just going to take a couple more. Has there been research on which of these plants have fungal symbiosis? It seems that the plants that do well in native soils are good candidates.
There hasn't been a lot. So I think the biggest challenge is because native plants are, and most plants in general, are very specific in their symbiotic relationships. You have to know first which ones they interact with the most, or a few genera or a few species of fungal um, symbiotes. So no, there really hasn't been a lot of that work. I was hoping to find some, not in science, really just in practice. So that was one of the things that came out in the survey. There's like 2 or 3 growers that grow a lot of native plants that absolutely love specific types of products, but it ranged. It was different for every grower. And so they ended up with a different mix of microorganisms depending on what product they use. So we couldn't find anything that was like uniform or consistent or research that was done.
Okay. Then we're going to take one more, and this is, should we keep western slope plants on the western slope or eastern slope on the eastern slope? Is moving a plant across the divide similar to moving a plant across an ocean? Um, and should we be concerned about that?
That's an excellent question and something we debate all the time. So you probably noticed on my list I had Acer grandidentatum, big tooth maple. It is native just to the western slope, but if you ask some botanists, they will tell you it is actually a disjunct population of our sugar maple that's from out east. So as that species, it covered our continent and receded to the east, in theory, that's a disjunct population. So is that a problem if we bring it back? I don't know. And that is sort of, it gets down to the ethics and the debate that's constantly happening. Now, one thing I want to be clear on, I think there's a big difference between gardening with Colorado native plants, no matter where part of Colorado they are, and restoring wildland areas. I think it's really important that our wildland areas are as close to the ecotypic natives as you possibly can. Gardens, I think we can be more flexible because which is better, Acer grandidentatum in your yard, or say, an Asiatic Acer palmatum, which is from Asia. What's better there, like to have in our Front Range gardens? I would say Acer grandidentatum. So I think it's a spectrum, just like, I don't think it's black or white. I think it's a spectrum, just like the fully native to the invasive discussion.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Jen. We're going to have to wrap it up there.